why do I have to go home at midnight?
Bibbidi bobbidi boo. I have never, ever missed an opportunity to be a fairy godmother. So I have no problem with the notion that I believe in magic, as I do.
Welcome to the Grand Parade Podcast. I'm your host, Independent City Hall reporter, Matt Stickland. Does it feel better to say Matt Stickland, Independent City Hall reporter? Either way, it's me. I'm your host, Matt Stickland, City Hall reporter who works for himself, meaning independent. I'm just stalling at this point. Friday, March 21st was a big day in Halifax's municipal budget playoffs. Council approved unsustainability and bought an armoured personnel carrier for the Halifax Regional Police. Although there were some obvious lowlights, Friday's debate may prove consequential for the city of Halifax because the police just gave unions and activists the blueprint on how to get what you want out of the municipal government. So without any further ado, let's get into it. The first motion that was debated on Friday was a motion from Mayor Andy Fillmore to keep the tax rate flat. At the start of the budget debates, the property tax rate was sitting at about 7.5%. Of that 7.5%, property values going up accounted for just over 4.5% of the tax rate, and the rest of the tax rate, about 2.7%, is set by council, which gives us the total tax rate of just over 7.5%. If you get lost in the numbers, what's important to understand is that no matter what, taxes are going up by at least that 4.5%. What council is trying to do is make the tax rate they control, the 2.7%, smaller so people feel like they're saving money. This is hard for council to do because councils have been trying to keep the tax rate low instead of making sure the city is well run for the better part of 12 years. And as a result, the city of Halifax is in dire financial straits. This was explained by the city's chief financial officer, Jerry Blackwood, in answer to a question from Councillor Janet Steele. Steele wanted to know how it was possible to starve the city of revenue by keeping taxes low, but also magically make Halifax a sustainable city without revenue streams. This question initially seemed to break Chief Financial Officer Jerry Blackwood's brain for a bit, but once his brain rebooted, he said this.
Thank you. That was a little bit, to unpack with that question. So, we'll talk a little bit about, the balance adjustment list, right? And I think Councillor Purdy said, not calling that out, but staff always pulls a rabbit out of the hat or does something. That's not a way that we should be doing budgets, is like at the end, going into reserves, going into one-time funding. Like, we are running out of options, right? You take the Central Library Reserve, the only other reserve contribution really that you have would be climate action tax. So I'm just going to bring things back to a couple of years ago. We were putting $32 million a year into reserves that were funded from the general rate. That's $32 million that we were putting away to fund debt. What staff are trying to do is be sustainable, because what I think council really needs to pay attention to is your capital plan. Your capital plan in the next 4 years is approximately $2 billion. Now, we have cost sharing, and we will continue to look at cost sharing. I think we do a very good job at going after federal government programs, getting funding partners. There's a graph in the deck. I don't know if anybody saw it the other day. You're looking at this year, your debt servicing costs, $43 million. In 2 years' time, they're going up to, these are bad, 61. You're taking another $20 million a year in debt servicing costs. That $32 million that we're putting away every year that we were doing 2 years ago, that is going to mitigate the tax increases when we have to take that debt servicing cost out. That's the long game. That's the fiscal sustainability that we're trying to do. And I'll tell you right now, it's probably not enough in terms of the debt that we got to take on. Council right now, the last debenture you approved, your temporary borrowing resolution, I think is about $325 million. That's debt you have approved that projects are in flight that we will be taking out. So that's what we're trying to do. So we were putting 32 million in reserves 2 years ago. Last year, to mitigate the tax increase, we cut 7 million out of that, right? So now you're down to 25 million, right? If we did any other cuts to reserve funding, right? As Dave mentioned earlier, on $10 million over 20-year money, that's an extra 4 million. I know it doesn't sound like a lot in the big scheme, but those increases will hit you in the future. What staff is trying to do is really trying to be sustainable. And when you push things out or say not do these things, we'll take some from reserves, it just comes back and compounds the next year. The other thing to Councillor Steele's question on some of the ballot items with respect to, things that are on there for approval, like I'll just use the 10 firefighters. That's very affordable this year. It's a $2 million cost that you got to make up next year. So like if you take the $10 million on the central library, you put the firefighters in, that's now almost $13 million that you got to make. That's 2% on the tax increase before you add a position, before you add a new service. So I know that might have been a little bit long-winded. I hope that might have gave some context to your question.
Or, in simple, non-accounting terms, if council keeps making bad financial decisions like canceling the library's strategic reserve, the city will be bankrupt sooner rather than later. Essentially, when the library was built, the city started putting money away for its maintenance and replacement. Now that the central library needs new floors, needs a new book sorting machine, among other things, this reserve could be used to pay for the renovations the central library now needs. Without this reserve, central library renovations and all library renovations would be funded out of the capital budget with debt or out of the general rate, both of which increase taxes more in future years than we will save this year by moving the money around. A lot of the councillors could see through this fiscal sustainability shell game, but not enough. Councillors Sam Austin, Sean Cleary, Patty Cuddle, Nancy Hartling, Virginia Hinch, Tony Mancini, Catherine Morse, and Laura White voted to maintain their credibility as good fiscal stewards. Halifax's responsible councillors lost to the Spendthrift Rebellion, made up of Budget Committee Chair Kathy Daigle-Gammon, Mayor Andy Fillmore, and councillors Billy Gillis, David Hensby, Trish Purdy, Jean Saint-Amand, Janet Steele, and the councillor who thanked the CFO for his quote-unquote perspective before ignoring his expert advice, Becky Kent. This fiscal mistake will save you 0.77% on your property taxes this year. This move will also cost you more in future taxes, as we will have to repay a massive debt caused by not having enough money for capital expenditures like central library repairs, like the floor, and the book sorting machine. Good job, team. High fives all around. The flat tax option also included a slew of other cuts that were mostly uncontroversial and seemed like genuine efficiencies found by city staff. For example, Parks and Rec think they can do all the work they plan to do for $300,000 less, so that was cut, saving money with no loss of work. Councillor Sam Austin also successfully lobbied to have $100,000 in funding saved so Dartmouth could have some concerts this year. Halifax Transit will keep 10 old buses on the road for 2 years longer for the cost of about $2 million. The transit HR person was also added to this motion, and it too passed. Councillors, in this case, listen to Jerry Blackwood, who told them that,
just with respect to Councillor Wright's comments about affordability. So, like, when you invest in transit, you're investing in affordability. When you invest in libraries, you're investing in affordability. When you invest in parks and recreation, you are investing in affordability, right?
And improving transit and making good fiscal moves was important to a lot of councillors this debate. Like freshly returned from Montreal, Patty Cuddle, who best summarized it during the debate when she said this.
Sometimes I think we have to take a big step back, right? And it's easy when we're sitting here to get into the weeds of every single item, looking at the minutia of it all. When we step back and think about it, on average, the average person pays all the taxes that they pay. municipal taxes only are about 10%, which isn't a lot. Part of our challenge here and our problem is that, the municipal fiscal frameworks that we need to operate with they're antiquated. They're not meeting the current needs of the demands that are placed on municipalities. Relying solely on property taxes to fund major infrastructure makes our financial management decisions very difficult. And we know that municipal services, they're really important to people. They impact, unlike any other order of government, they really impact the daily quality of life in so many ways, from how we get to work in the morning, to how we spend our leisure and recreation time, our sense of safety and well-being in the places that we live. I just want to note that in terms of housing, taxes don't drive market rates, right? Landlords will charge what the market will bear. And reducing property taxes doesn't necessarily exactly translate into a reduction in rent. But the solution to affordable housing doesn't lie in municipal taxation. It doesn't lie in what we set our rate at. It's not going to make that much of a difference to the vast majority of renters. There are some things for me that I feel are critical and are related to our core responsibilities, those being, of course, transit. We need to fix our transit system. It's not working right now, and it is one of our core responsibilities. I don't think this is the time to back away from that. When I talk to residents, their choice is either taking the bus, that if it's not working for them, they have to buy a car, and that is a significant cost that they'll have to bear. So we need transit to work.
And she's right. By focusing in on the tax rate as a measure of affordability, Council is missing the forest for the trees. Council could make life way more affordable for us if they had the courage to raise fees and taxes and invest in things like transit. At this point, I'd just like to pause and say that I'm extending some benefit of the doubt to Mayor Andy Fillmore with a firm expiration date. Because even though he was advocating for unsustainable cuts, he did say we now have to change how we are doing things, and he also kept saying things like this.
And just take this opportunity to repeat again to colleagues that we are going to be doing things a little bit differently this year. I'm going to work with all of you about that motion in April, about how we're going to find savings beginning in the next year, beginning in April, on operations to save money on savings and efficiencies. So I don't believe it's magic. I think that we are in a good position to be able to cover these costs and have those reductions in the coming year. And when this budget process concludes, I intend to introduce a motion in April to direct staff to find those savings and efficiencies, and have had productive conversations with the CAO.
If Fillmore genuinely wants to try and generate new revenue alongside the sweeping cuts he's proposing, we will see him start attending Transportation Standing Committee meetings to weigh in on and encourage the committee to jack up parking fees on large vehicles. Or, the mayor's only special power in the HRM is that he can ask for staff reports. In April, if Fillmore starts to get staff reports about raising fees, raising taxes, or generating revenue in other ways that would justify his seemingly reckless fiscal actions during this debate. So, start your clock and let's see where our mayor's at in May. Will it be the summer of Andy's redemption arc, or are we once again to be disappointed by empty political promises? Speaking of disappointing, Halifax is getting an armoured personnel carrier. Councillors Virginia Hinch and Sean Cleary were the only votes no. When this passed, a couple members of the public responded with shouts of shame and briefly disrupted proceedings. Regardless of whether or not you agree with their tactics, I, for one, am happy we live in a place where people care about each other so deeply they're willing to do civil disobedience. We may need folks like them in the near future with all this talk of a 51st state. Two things about this debate deserve a bit more scrutiny. The first is that the people who spoke against the tank were concerned that it would start showing up at protests. The cops reassured council that APCs would not show up at protests. The cops explained APCs are a tool for the police's Specialized Emergency Response Team, or ERT. Before continuing, it's important to mention two things. The first is that the police do not share their operational tactics with the public, and the second is that the ERT's specialty is urban warfare. After George Floyd was murdered, there was a handful of Black Lives Matter protests in the HRM. I went to cover the biggest one, and I was a bit worried about being kettled by the police. As the protest marched, I went out and did some reconnaissance of the flanks to see if there were police officers being held in reserve. Unsurprisingly, there were a bunch of serious-looking HRP officers in ball caps pretending that they weren't watching me like hawks as I took pictures of their truck. If these officers in reserve on a side street with no riot gear were in fact Halifax's ERT acting as a quick reaction force as they appeared to be, why wouldn't they bring all of their tools to a job where those tools might be needed? Councillor Sam Austin changed his mind for two reasons. The first reason is that those times when APCs are needed. And here's what Austin said.
But it just didn't make any sense to me to be buying an armored vehicle when supposedly we have an integrated police force and we already have access to one through the RCMP. And at the time, there was really not a thing that was presented during budget that, gave me any reason to come off that position. The work has since been done. As I read this report, it is concerning to me that 33% of the time, our police force has not had access to it. So my original assumption that we have a vehicle because the RCMP has one actually is not nearly as true as I thought it was.
Except, if you stop to think about that for 1 second, something doesn't quite line up. Halifax Regional Police spokespeople have told me, and Chief Don McLean has told Council, that so far, Halifax Regional Police have been lucky to have never needed an APC. Has the APC been needed 0 times, or has the APC been unavailable for a third of the shootouts and firefights the cops were involved in last year? Since we would all know if the HRM was an active war zone, what Austin really said was that 33% of the time is when cops wanted an armored personnel carrier and it was not available. It is a want, not a need. It is hopefully never a need. But that brings us to the second reason why Austin changed his mind. The police union lodged an occupational health and safety complaint. This is a pretty complex answer, so I'm just going to let City Lawyer John Traves explain the ramifications of the police union's OHS complaint. Here's what City Lawyer John Traves told Council.
And I have some notes, so I'll read from them rather than wing it. But the Occupational Health and Safety Act is critically important piece of legislation, and it outranks and takes precedent over any conflicting legislation. The fundamental obligation on employers, of which HRM is one, under the Act is found at Section 13, which provides that every employer shall take every precaution that is reasonable in the circumstances to ensure the health and safety of persons at or near the workplace. And they have to conduct their undertaking, in this case, which is the provision of police services, such that employees are not exposed to health or safety hazards as a result of that undertaking. Provincial case law has explained that the workplace is not a single location, but wherever the employer's undertaking is performed, wherever the employees are working for us. The employer's obligation, therefore, extends to wherever its employees happen to be performing their work. The Act provides broad powers to the officers, and as I think it is publicly aware, we have received an occupational health and safety complaint with respect to the provision of an armored rescue vehicle. But in pursuing that, officers and inspectors are to ensure compliance with the Act. These powers include stop work orders, the laying of charges, and the requiring of the acquisition of safety equipment or other devices. There is no obvious upper limit on the expenses that an officer can require an employer such as HRM to go to provide a safe workplace, although it stands to reason that the officer's interpretation of the Section 13 obligation is itself subject to a reasonableness evaluation, right? Which is why this debate is important, why it's in front of you. It has to take into account that the employers do not have limitless resources. In situations where an employer could not provide the requisite safety equipment due to financial constraints, then the employer simply could not carry on that particular undertaking, and we would be ordered to stop the work, as opposed to proceeding in any event. In the present context, it is possible for an officer to issue a stop work order to police, i.e. not to respond to certain calls without the necessary safety equipment if they feel that it's necessary. And that in itself can be a breach of the occupational health and safety order. An example of occupational health and safety charges being laid against a government entity are the sorts of charges laid against the RCMP in the wake of the June 14th murder of the 3 members in Moncton. The RCMP was charged and convicted of failing to provide appropriate use of force equipment, such as patrol carbines and related training for responding to an active shooter event in an open environment, and as well failing to ensure the health and safety of its members, particularly in equipping and training them to handle such threats. In that case, certain members only had sidearms or pistols and therefore had no meaningful way to engage the killer, who was at that time armed with a rifle. In essence, then, an employer can be found to be in breach of the Act after a workplace death or injury occurs, whether or not an order has been made by the division. An employer can also be found to be in breach of the Act where a workplace death or injury occurs, where a complaint is lodged with the division, and where investigation has been carried out and an order made. Where an employer disagrees with the decision officer, the employer can appeal the order to the Labor Board and subsequently to the courts. However, you have to comply with the order in the interim. And so that is essentially, my education for folks on the law. That does not take into account, though, through you, Chair, to the obligations that have been imposed as a result of the Westray inquiry through Bill C-45, which holds that the operating minds of entities such as an organization like ours, which is council and the senior officials, to ensure the safety of their employees. So there is potential for additional penalties or liabilities, criminally and otherwise, as a consequence of failing to take the necessary steps. And so that becomes this debate as to where we sit. Something that is frequently overlooked by urban Canadians is that, relatively speaking, Canada is a heavily armed nation. Unfortunately, there are over 2.3 million Canadian men and women with firearms licenses. The vast majority of these individuals own numerous unregistered, non-restricted rifles. And this number of licensed firearm owners does not include individuals who own guns prior to the institution of modern licensing. I say that because it factors into the sorts of advice that I would have to give you in camera or otherwise, but it's important for the record to understand the situation that we face, because it factors into the analysis under the occupational health and safety legislation and where that sort of goes. And of course, we have obligations at law under the Police Act. So the Police Act, essentially, if I was to start, where a municipality, and this is the change since 2019, where this, council elected not to provide an ARV at that time. And at that time, you will recall that we had a part-time ART team. And subsequent to that, we now have a full-time ART team because we're a municipality that is of a size, unfortunately, where that ART team has become necessary to have as a full-time on rotation or on standby. And so, Section 35 of the Police Act then potentially comes into play because it provides that the municipality is responsible, municipality being council, for providing and maintaining, quote, an adequate, efficient, and effective police department, together with, and I quote, all the necessary infrastructure and administration which service shall include crime prevention, law enforcement, assistance to victims of crime, emergency and enhanced services, and public order maintenance. So the obligation doesn't necessarily rest on the chief or on the CAO. It comes back to this council to adequately provide for the provisioning of the police force that we find ourselves having to provide and having stood up.
Even though buying an armored personnel carrier means we are ignoring the warnings of the 1987 documentary RoboCop, the Halifax Regional Police Union does deserve a shout-out for what is, I think, a bit of inadvertent solidarity with the other municipal unions. The police union has shown all the other HRM unions the easiest way to compel change out of City Council. Collective bargaining? Nope. Striking? Nope. Litigation and administrative complaints. Are you a municipal union in the middle of negotiating a new collective agreement? Have you considered lodging an occupational health and safety complaint? There may be an upper limit on what salaries you are being offered, but remember,
There is no obvious upper limit on the expenses that an officer can require an employer such as HRM to go to provide a safe workplace.
and I suspect there are lessons here for other advocates too. For example, does your bike lane end abruptly in a car lane because your life is not as important to HRM's traffic engineers as saving a driver 5 seconds on a right-hand turn, even though the University of Toronto did a study in 2018 which found that over 50% of drivers don't even look for pedestrians or cyclists when they make right-hand turns, which means Halifax designed an intersection which they reasonably should have known is likely to kill you? Don't bother writing your counselor. Be like the police union. Organize and litigate. At any rate, the discussion that no one bothered to have is really what was most disappointing about this debate. If Halifax has an emergency response team, that team needs an armored personnel carrier as part of their toolkit. As part of urban warfare, you need a mechanized infantry force. You just do. But the HRM already has an ERT. They hang out in Burnside at the RCMP HQ. We are trying to integrate our police forces. So why do we need 2 emergency response teams? If we're trying to save money, not buying a tank and not paying a small specialized infantry unit's worth of salaries and weaponry could save us a truckload of money. Alternatively, if we do want our own ERT, Council should be trying to pay less in our RCMP contract since we don't want to use their ERT, and then we should not be hiring 14 more officers until we get our lower ERT discounted rate. And finally, Councillor Becky Kent put a motion on the floor to change the budget so that it would estimate higher revenues from the deed transfer tax. This higher estimate wouldn't be an issue if the real estate market this year is bumping. But if the real estate market this year falters, not only would this year's budget be short, but next year's budget would be doubly short as we would have to make up the shortfall through our taxes. Chief Financial Officer Jerry Blackwood told Council that the biggest risk is this.
There's a lot of, you can get more intelligence around the residential side and how many permits were going to be issued, new projected units, right? CMHC provides a pretty robust report. Commercial side of things have no clue of the activity, right? And 2 years ago, as we said, just like boom, it was reported in all Nova Scotia. Halifax Shopping Center sold. That was $5 million just dropped in our lap like that. We have no idea to predict those sales, and that sale of the Halifax Shopping Center actually saved our year that year because we were starting to trend down the other way. But that's the volatility is on the commercial side.
Meaning, if Council had approved this, they would have been betting that commercial real estate sales would be gangbusters, even though a trade war is scheduled to kick off on April 2nd, day 2 of this city's fiscal year. This motion, thankfully, lost. But as a result, David Hensby, Becky Kent, Tony Mancini, and Trish Purdy have destroyed their credibility as good fiscal stewards of your tax dollars. Mayor Andy Fillmore is being extended the benefit of the doubt until May as discussed, but he too voted to bet on commercial real estate in a trade war. Everyone else's councillor, I'm happy to report, passed this test. There's still a lot more to debate, and Halifax's budget playoffs will continue on Monday, March 4th. These debates will start at 1 p.m. at City Hall. So, that's it for me today. How did you like the show? Let me know. I can be found on social media wherever @signs are bought and sold for free at Land of Sticks on Blue Sky and Instagram. And this episode will be going up on YouTube probably about half an hour after it goes up on the audio services. But that'll do it for me today. Bye!